question for today is, if wisdom doesn't fix life's problems now, then what good is it? And that's the question that Solomon answers for us in chapters 10 through 12. It's with this spirit that we're going to see how Solomon concludes the quest that he set out on, to see where this journey leads us, begin to dissect his final conclusions together. Solomon's just spent chapters 7 through 9 showing the things that are better for man. He's established the superiority of godly wisdom over everything else, because everything that Solomon's come to in his journey of endeavor has led him to a dead end, even wisdom of this world. But he differentiates that there's a certain type of wisdom, a godly wisdom, for the one who sees the sun, who can see the purpose of what this life is trying to accomplish. He says that there's benefit, there's profit. That's the only thing that has lasting value in this life. And so he says, even though this is the thing that has lasting value, it's not going to fix all of life's problems now. In fact, he says that you need to realize that when you go about pursuing it. So when adversity strikes in chapter 7 and verse 13, you consider, you reflect, because God is trying to save you. God is trying to teach you that there's nothing above Him. He's trying to teach you to revere Him in your life. And we'll never fully understand everything in our life because ultimate wisdom is unattainable. Solomon said, I thought I'd be able to figure this all out. I thought I'd be able to find this quest, to search it out by my wisdom. But when I tried to search it out, I found that it was far from me. It was unattainable. And so Solomon implicitly identifies that faith is required to bridge the gap. That faith is necessary to get us from where we are today to where we're ultimately trying to get to. And he identified two types of faith. Faith in the sense of that God will eventually make things right, that there will be a judgment, and that things will be reconciled, that all the loose ends of this life will be tied up. That was in chapter 8 primarily, even though it's interspersed throughout the whole book, as we saw. And the other aspect of faith that he identifies is faith in providence, that God is working through the life of a believer to get them to that day, to allow them to be a part of that great reward that's in the future. The calamity, though, is that people don't place the proper valuation on wisdom. Even though godly wisdom has this immense value associated with it, for those who can look long term, the issue is that people in this life don't appreciate wisdom. And that's how he concluded chapter 9, with the poor man who was able to deliver the city in his wisdom. Yet everybody forgot about that poor man when the situation was done. There's something like this that actually occurs in Israel's history in 2 Samuel 20, verses 15 to 22. We won't turn there for the sake of time, but that's what the instance where the wise woman saved the city when Joab was going to destroy it and ended up throwing the head of the man over the wall so that the whole city would be saved. You wonder if that's perhaps where Solomon got this instance. But nonetheless, it reveals that people don't appreciate it. And he's worried. I believe that Solomon's concerned that after establishing that wisdom wasn't going to fix it all, that us, his readers, would say, well, maybe wisdom isn't really that great then. Solomon says it is great. Godly wisdom is what you need to achieve. It's what you need to seek after. It not only has a benefit in the life to come, but it has a practical benefit in your life today. And so in chapter 10 through chapter 11 and verse 6, he gives us numerous instances of how wisdom will actually help us in this life. And so I'd like to go through some of those now in this fifth class on applied wisdom, because we'll not only take a look at this section, but we'll begin taking a look at the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes to set ourselves up, Lord willing, for tomorrow's class of where we really dissect what it is that Solomon wants us to take away from this book. So these are the aspects that we'll look at in regards to applied wisdom. We'll look at maintaining a wise reputation, the importance of that, and how difficult that can be. We'll take a look at dealing with those in rulership and how wisdom assists us in that regard. Wisdom and approach of how we deal with situations in verses 8 and 9. Balancing forethought and action. Planning versus execution. Then we'll take a look at wisdom and speech and the impact that our interactions should have on others if we're demonstrating wisdom. We'll look at wisdom and rulership in verses 16 to 20 to see how the behavior of those in authority impacts, for positive or for negative, those who they are responsible for. We'll take a look as well in chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, at maintaining the right perspective. and we'll see that godly wisdom has a benefit in all aspects of life. So he begins then in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 10 by taking a look at maintaining a wise reputation. He says, "Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary, or the perfumer, to send forth a stinking savor. So doth a little folly in him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor." He says that the oil of the apothecary, perfume, is a very sweet aroma, very difficult to combine the right spices to get that aroma, that fragrance. But even though it's very difficult to get that aroma, to get that fragrance, all it takes is a little fly in the ointment to ruin the whole thing. He says in verse 3 that there's a fool who goes out and declares to everybody that he's a fool. Everybody knows that he's a fool because he has no discretion. His indiscretions are right out in the public. Everybody can see that. But not the one in verse 1. The one in verse 1 is done in private. Because if somebody saw the fly get into the ointment, wouldn't they remove it? They wouldn't leave it there and allow it to rot. So Solomon's saying that those things that are done in secret, those things that are indiscretions, that are withheld from the public view, if you are in wise repute, be aware that those things will become known. And the stinking savor of those things that you do outside of public view will be made manifest. The wise are prudent enough not to show those things to the public, but he says those things will become known. It's very difficult to have a good reputation, isn't it? It takes years to establish. It takes a moment to ruin and to mar that reputation. We can think of examples, even within our own community, of where this has happened. The challenge, though, is to think about ourselves and to see what areas of my life are like that. Christ says the things that are done in secret will be proclaimed from the housetop. What areas in my life am I withholding from the public view that would ruin my reputation if they became known? Hopefully those things don't exist. But if they do, Solomon's counseling us. If the flies are in there, the stink will come out. So make sure that you don't allow those things into your reputation. And he starts with a good reputation because that's the basis for who we are, isn't it? That affects every interaction that we have in life, the reputation that we carry with us. He then goes on in verses 4 through 6 to talk about dealing with those in rulership, or verses 4 through 7 rather. He says in verse 4, "If the spirit of the ruler rise up against thee, leave not thy place, for yielding pacifieth great offenses." The wise are able to diffuse difficult situations through composure. He says if somebody accuses you of something, don't just respond reflexively. Don't just quit. Respond temperately. Think about what you're going to do, because if you respond temperately, then a wise answer turns away wrath. You can actually pacify things through wisdom, through thinking, and through proper interaction with other people. But he gives us the counsel in verses 5 through 7 that those in authority, those in rulership, may not necessarily appreciate the wisdom that you're manifesting. Yes, it may be able to help in difficult scenarios, but don't be surprised if you don't get promoted, if you don't get furthered in this life because you're manifesting godly wisdom. Because those in authority don't always appreciate godly wisdom. Sometimes fools get put into positions of authority. Look at Haman, for example. This fool who was put into a position of authority when Mordecai was much more capable. Solomon says in verse 5, that's an evil to be expected under the sun. But don't allow that to affect your approach to life. Don't allow that to affect your valuation of wisdom. That's what he gets into in verses 8 and 9. In verse 8, "He that diggeth a pit shall fall into it, and whoso breaketh an hedge, a serpent shall bite him." He's now talking about wisdom and approach, because those who are fools, those who don't apply themselves to godly wisdom, have the belief that the ends justify the means. He's already talked about that a little bit earlier in the book, a section that, unfortunately, we had to skip over. But in chapter 8 and verse 11, he covers this aspect. He says, "Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil." Somebody conducts themselves in a way that does not have integrity, but they achieve the results. Nothing seems to happen to that individual. They get what they want. The result is there, so other people see that. There was no punishment for that. It's only wrong if you get caught. Other people adopt that type of an approach. People change their behavior to adopt that. Solomon's saying here in verses 8 and 9 in chapter 10, don't do that. If you dig a pit for somebody else, if you're trying to get a certain result by trying to trip somebody else up, by compromising your own morals, you're going to be the person that gets hurt in the end. You're going to fall into the ditch that you dig for somebody else if you're carrying around vengeance and the desire to make sure that somebody else trips on your way to the top. He says, he that breaketh an hedge, a serpent shall bite him. If you get involved in other people's business, this hedge, that boundary that exists between two pieces of property, if you start digging away at that, you're going to be the one that suffers for getting involved in business not belonging to you. And in verse 9, whoso removeth stones shall be hurt therewith, and he that cleaveth wood shall be endangered thereby. If you get involved in dangerous activities, you will eventually be the one that gets injured. Who can take fire in his bosom and not be burned? And so Solomon's giving the counsel to be aware of the activities that you're involved in and the approach that you use. Don't allow other people's behaviors to change your approach. Continue to move forward with wisdom and integrity. He then goes on in verses 10 and 11 to talk about the need to balance forethought and to balance action. He says in verse 10, if the iron be blunt, and he do not whet the edge, then must he put to more strength, but wisdom is profitable to direct. So he said, if you're going to go out and chop wood, don't take a dull axe. At least sharpen the axe before you go out, because then you can do it with applying less effort. So he says a little bit of forethought, a little bit of planning can make the execution so much better than just going out and doing something. But in the very next verse, in verse 11, he says, surely the serpent will bite without enchantment, and a babbler is no better. And the babbler is somebody who with their tongue can actually charm the serpent. That's how they used to do it before the instruments existed. So he says there's this person of great skill. They can charm the serpent. They can charm the snake. But if he just sits there and the snake bites him, what good is all of his skill? He hasn't implemented it until it's too late. So he's saying there's a balance between forethought and planning and execution. Every situation is going to be different in terms of the amount of planning that's necessary before executing the plan. Every situation is different, but the wise, they will know the amount of planning that's necessary. But if you spend all day sharpening the axe, you'll never get any wood cut. And so he's giving us instruction not necessarily on how to chop wood, but how to approach life and to balance those two things together. He then goes on in verses 12 through 15 to talk about the wisdom and how we speak and how we interact with other people. And the question to us is, what impact does our speech have on those around us? He says in verse 12 that the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious. So these words are actually helpful. They're constructive. They're edifying. They build people up. But Solomon has a lot to say about the words of the fool. In verse 14, a fool is full of words. The fool speaks authoritatively on things that he doesn't know anything about. This is the person who knows everything about everything. He wearies other people around him in verse 15. The labor of the foolish wearieth everyone around them. They get tired of hearing all the things that the fool has to say. And he or she is so stubborn in verse 15 that he knoweth not how to go to the city. Even the obvious eludes the fool. There's a giant pathway that goes into the city, but the fool is so stuck on his argument, on his solution, on his way of doing things, that even the obvious pathway to the solution evades him. Everybody else can see it, but not the fool. The fool is stuck on his own path. And we all think, yep, I know that guy. The one who knows everything about everything, wearies people around him, misses the obvious solution, leaves all kind of wake in his path in interacting with other people. But once again, the question is, what about us? What kind of interactions do we have with other people? And what impact do we have on those around us? Are we gracious? Are we constructive? Or do our results mimic those of the fool? Take the time to think through a few examples in your own life when you have a few moments. Or if you can't think of any examples, pay attention for the next time that you have an interaction with somebody else and see how that goes. Next time something comes up, see what kind of interactions, if the person walks away feeling uplifted, even when difficult situations arise and we have to address them. Does that person feel uplifted or bashed down? Have we been effective in communicating those things? It's very easy when we get a negative response to attribute that entirely to the other person. That, they don't like hearing this or that, or it's kind of their problem. As if the way that we approach things has no bearing at all on the way that people respond to us. Solomon's saying that the true proof is the impact that we have on other people, of being wise or foolish. In verses 16 to 20, he talks about wisdom and rulership. He says, "Woe to thee, O land, when thy king is a child, and thy princes eat in the morning." He says everybody suffers when you have foolish people in charge. When your king is a child, when he's somebody that's inexperienced, well, you can make up for that inexperience if you have good counselors, as we've seen throughout the week. But even the princes here are eating in the morning. The morning time is the time when you get things done, when business is conducted. But the princes are eating in the morning. They're feasting at a time when you're supposed to be taking care of business. And as a result, the land suffers because the essential things of the kingdom are being left undone. But in verse 17, the land benefits. "Blessed art thou, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles, and thy princes eat in due season for strength and not for drunkenness." The son of nobles, those who are mature, those who take their responsibility seriously, those who are educated in the ways of rulership. The land is blessed when you have people like that in authority, people like that in positions of responsibility. The counselors eat in due season, when it's time to eat, after business is done, after they put first things first. And it's a real reminder for each one of us who are in positions of authority or positions of responsibility to realize that our actions impact other people around us. That it can be for good or it can be for bad. And that we need to take those responsibilities seriously. That we're not just responsible for ourselves. That applies to parents with children, with elders in the ecclesia, even with young people in CYC, interacting with one another. He says in verse 18, "By much slothfulness the building decayeth, and through idleness of the hands the house droppeth through." He says if you don't do anything when you see a problem, you're going to end up with a disaster. Now I was thinking about this yesterday when we saw the roof leaking over here. So I imagine they're probably going to fix that up top. But somebody might say, well, the solution is to put a bucket on the floor, and that'll take care of the problem. Solomon's saying if you see an issue and you don't do something about it, the whole roof's going to collapse. The whole building's going to fall through. He says the wise person can see an issue coming. They see the freight train and they do something about it. They don't just hope that it's going to go away. He's saying use some forethought. Look into the future a little bit if you see something coming and do something about it. That's what those who are wise in rulership will do. In verse 19, he said, "A feast is made for laughter, and wine maketh merry, but money answereth all things." Maybe this is a message that we've missed in the book of Ecclesiastes, that money's the answer for all things. I don't think so, because Solomon's whole premise in this chapter is all about applying wisdom. He's saying when it comes to those in positions of authority, in positions of rulership, you can have feasting, you can have merriment, but that has one purpose, to bring enjoyment for a very short period of time. But if you have those in positions of authority who are frugal and can use resources wisely, then you can actually retain those and use them in multiple different areas versus just one thing, feasting for a short period of time to enjoy that. So he said frugality and being a good steward is very important when you're in a position of rulership. Resources are limited. Make sure that you use them wisely. In verse 20, he says, "Curse not the king, no, not in thy thought, and curse not the rich in thy bedchamber, for a bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell the matter." We've all heard this expression, haven't we? Well, where did you hear that? Oh, a little birdie of the air told me. A lot of times we focus on, well, I shouldn't say the wrong thing. But Solomon takes it a step further back and he says, you know what, don't even think the wrong thing. Because if you're thinking the wrong thing, It will eventually come out in one way or the other. He says this in two different ways. Curse not the king, no, not in thy thought, and curse not the rich in thy bedchamber. The bedchamber is the most private room of the house. And isn't the most private room of our house the mind? Keep those thoughts from entering your mind, because in one way or the other, even if it's not in verbal communication, some birdie of the air, in the way that we respond to somebody, the way that we interact, it will come out what we think. So make sure that you're controlling what you think, and you won't have to worry about saying the wrong thing. He then goes on in verses 1 through 6 to talk about the importance of having the right perspective. And this is an extremely critical section, because this section applies to the way that we approach life. He says you have to have the right perspective. You can either be pessimistic or you can be cautiously optimistic. He identifies cautious optimism as the best alternative. Take a look at what he says here in verse 1. Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. What's he talking about? Well, in the time of planting, you would go out to the alluvial soils when they were flooded, and you would put your seed down. Now, food was a limited resource in those days. It's not like today of where you can go down and get the all-you-can-eat out of the 3 tubs of food downstairs. If you took food that you had today and you sowed it in the field, that was something that you were withholding from your family in the short term, with hopes that you would see it again after many days, that you would gain an increase in the time of harvest. Isn't that the case for so many things in life? Of where you sow in the short term, hoping for some kind of long-term benefit. Solomon says, make sure that you're thinking long-term, that you don't myopically look at the short term, but you look into the future, and you try to do what you can to set the stage for success. This applies to our children. Every parent knows that you do not get short-term gratification from children. It's very, very difficult to be a parent because you put the effort in and you don't get a lot of thanks back immediately. But the hope is that the long-term result will be positive, that you will reap something in the long term, something positive. That's true of ecclesial life. That's true of all aspects of life. He talks in verse 2 about the need for hospitality. Give a portion to 7, and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Give to 7. Give completely. And give beyond completely. Give enough and more than enough. While it's in the power of your hand to do it, be generous, be gracious, because you don't know, from a practical standpoint even, you don't know what evil will be coming on the earth. You may need to be in a position later of where you're relying on the grace of somebody else. And the overarching point here is that we're all dependent on God's grace. And being gracious to each other, of giving enough and more than enough, is merely a recognition of the fact that everything that we have truly belongs to God in the way that we treat each other. In verse 3, he goes on to say that there's circumstances of life that are just beyond your control. He said where the clouds are, it's going to rain. The tree falls in a certain area, that's where it's going to stay. It's no good trying to wish that the clouds are going to go away. The clouds are there, it's going to rain. The tree falls, you can't stand underneath it and try to move it somewhere else. Right? You're going to get smashed in the process. He says there's things that are beyond your control. So what? So what should you do about it? Solomon says in verse 4, get on with life. Get on with life. Don't worry about the things that you can't control. He says in verse 4, he that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. There's always going to be an excuse to not do what needs to get done. There's always going to be an excuse to not do what needs to get done. Focus on what you can control. Don't focus on what you can't control. Get out there and do what needs to be done, and do it now. In verse 5, he says you're never going to figure everything out. This is a point that he's come to at numerous stages in the book, but now he's consolidating everything for us as we read through it. He says, as thou knowest not what is in the way of the Spirit, or what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so thou knowest not the works of God who maketh all. It truly is a miracle, isn't it, how life can form in the womb of a woman. How does this happen? How are bones created within the womb of a woman? Solomon says you're not really going to figure out where life comes from. You're not going to understand all the details of that. And so too, you're not going to understand how everything works in your life. He's saying, I'm not saying this to discourage you, because in verse 6, look at what he says. In the morning sow thy seed, in the evening withhold not thine hand, for thou knowest not whether shall prosper, either this or that, or whether they both alike shall be good. Here's the strategy, isn't it? All those things that we don't know about, that we can spend all of our time worrying about, thinking about. Solomon says, forget it. Go out and sow your seed, just like he said in verse 1. Go out and sow your seed. Do what needs to be done. Withhold not your hand. Be generous, as he said in verse 2. Why? Because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know the result. God might bring something good as a result. But the issue with us, and the issue with this world, is it's very results-oriented. It's all about the result. The process doesn't matter so much as long as we get to the end. And God is very process-oriented. The result is very important as well, but the process is what gets you to the result. You will not get the result without the process. Paul picks that up in the New Testament, of where we sow, we water, but it's God that gives the increase. And that's what Solomon says here. It may be that good will come from it. You just don't know. Pessimism results in inaction due to the uncontrollable events of life. Pessimism makes us focus on those things that we can't control, and it results in us getting nothing done. Whereas cautious optimism, it promotes opportunity to see God's hand at work. It promotes activity in our life of where we get out there and do what needs to be done. So often in life we can get bogged down worrying about the what ifs. Well, what if we do this? Or what if we do that? Well, this probably isn't the best time to start a seminar. Maybe we should do it this night of the week, or this strategy, or that strategy, this location. And we end up planning so long, sharpening the axe, that we never actually get out there and cut the wood. Solomon says, just get out there and do something. Yes, planning's important, but get out there and do what needs to be done. God will take care of the result if you're doing things the right way, and if you're taking the advantage of the opportunities that He's given to you. Now, we can't control the circumstances of life, but Solomon says there are two things that are very much within your control: your perspective and your actions. Your perspective needs to be cautious optimism. Certain matters of life are beyond our comprehension, and we need to come to grips with this. Otherwise, we're like Solomon. In chapter 2, verse 17, remember what his conclusion was? I hated life. That's the conclusion of somebody who does not accept that God is in control. Constantly wrestling with God. He spent his whole life wrestling with God, trying to do it himself. And the conclusion was that. Don't do that, he says. Be optimistic. Move forward. And this is one of the major findings of the book, to realize our inability to control the circumstances of life. And having realized this, to actually embrace it. It's one thing to accept it reluctantly. It's another thing to embrace it as God's mechanism for working in our lives. That it may be that God will give the increase. And this drives our actions. The second thing that we can control. And all the other things within life that we can't control. The second thing that we can control. To sow in faith, to be generous with what God has provided, and not to worry about what we can't understand or can't control. And this concludes Solomon's section on applied wisdom. He's given us quite a bit to think about here in this initial section, hasn't he? Well, initial in regards to the end. Because now he becomes very focused on talking to us about the end. In chapter 11, verse 7 through chapter 12 and verse 6, Solomon is going from the beginning of life to the end of life. And he's painting a very clear picture of what life is like and how we need to approach it. He starts in chapter 11 and verse 7 with a sunrise. In chapter 11, verses 7 through 10, we have a specific exhortation to the young. He starts with this sunrise in verse 7. Truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. We've all seen the sun coming up in the morning. Cloudless sky. The light begins to fill the sky. We have a whole day ahead of us of life, of activity, of energy. He says that's what youth is like. Youth, you have your whole life ahead of you. This vigor, this vitality that's associated with youth, it's all ahead of you, your whole life. But he immediately brings a sunset into the consideration in verse 8. But if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. All that cometh is vanity. He immediately brings the end into view, right at the point of the sunrise. He says there's going to be a sunset. The days of darkness are coming. You won't always feel young. The days of strength will wane, and the sun will set on your life. It's difficult for the young to imagine being old. In fact, it's the furthest thing from the mind of the young to think about being old. But Solomon's saying to be aware of the end at the beginning. Don't let the end catch you by surprise. Because I think the end caught Solomon by surprise. Be aware of the end when you start the beginning. Have the end in mind. And if you have the end in mind, that your time is limited, it will drive a lot more purposeful activity in the way that you live your life, because you will always be aware that you have a limited amount of time. Use it wisely. He says that the young need to be aware of this fact, that everything that's coming in this life is vanity. Look at what he says. All that cometh is vanity at the end of verse 8. All the achievements that are just over the horizon as the sun begins to rise, your whole life ahead of you. The sky is the limit. The world's your oyster. All these things that we hear in the world today about the opportunities for young people, for those who are educated. Solomon says, forget it. I've been to the end. I've gotten to the end. I've achieved more than everybody in this room combined can achieve. And that's not an overstatement, is it? Of what Solomon achieved in his life. And he says it's all vanity. It's all going nowhere. And we sit back and we think, man, this is pretty discouraging. If I'm a young person, what am I supposed to be taking away from this? I mean, talk about a demotivator. But Solomon's aware that this is where he's bringing the young. He says, I don't want to bring you to a point of demotivation. I want to bring you to the truth. And I want to tell you the truth up front, because it's better to hear it up front than to learn it the hard way. Don't be demotivated. Don't be depressed. Instead, in verse 9, here's what you should do. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. Don't be depressed about it. Don't be sad about it. He says, rejoice. Let your heart cheer you. So one should rejoice. One should still be cheerful. But the realization that these things are coming to an end should help to channel those energies. That's the key, is he's instructing the young to be energetic, to be excited. This is a blessing from God. But make sure that you channel your efforts into those things that are going to last. Channel your energies. Channel your vitality. Channel your excitement into things that are actually profitable. Because God is going to require those things of you. God expects you to use those opportunities wisely. He says in verse 10, remove sorrow. Remove sorrow from thy heart. Put away evil from thy flesh. For childhood and youth are vanity. God's designed it this way intentionally. Childhood and youth are vanity. They don't last. They're going to pass away. The youth, the energy that you have, the vitality, your body won't continue to work the way that it always does. You won't wake up feeling the way that you feel every day. Pain's going to set in. He says, don't worry though. God's designed it that way on purpose. Remove sorrow from your heart. Put away evil. Make sure that you're doing something for your Heavenly Father. And not just something, but doing your best. He says it's not enough to just refrain from doing evil. Refraining from evil is not what's going to endear us to God. The doing of positive good in our lives is what God is looking for. When God goes to require something from our lives, if all we've done is not done things, what are we going to present to our Heavenly Father? He says, yes, you need to remove evil, but you need to remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. Do it now, is what he says in chapter 12 and verse 1. This is his advice to the young. And so he's really trying to balance the message to the young, to get them to realize that youth is a great opportunity. Youth is a great blessing from God, but you have to use it wisely. Look at what he says here, that the light is sweet. Youth is a blessing, but remember the coming darkness. Remember it's not going to last. He says to rejoice in your youth in verse 9, but know that God will judge. Therefore, put away sorrow and remember your Creator now. Being aware of the end at the beginning channels those efforts into something that's actually profitable. Youth is a blessing from God. Be joyful, be active, be positive. But start with the end in mind. Use it wisely, is what he's saying to the youth, because the evil days are coming. The evil days that he speaks of in chapter 12 and verse 1 are the days of old age, the days of where the sun has passed the zenith in the sky and is now descending toward the other horizon, not the one from which it rose, but the one to which it is setting. These are the days when youth is a thing of the past, and vitality remains alive only in the memories of a time gone by. Solomon illustrates this through the imagery of a house falling into disrepair, falling into dilapidation, and eventually becoming ruined. This was once a house that was bustling with activity. Servants carrying corn into the house to feed those in the house, women grinding meal in the kitchen to provide for those young mouths that were filling the house, children running to and fro. This was a house and a home that was very much alive. There would have been expectant faces in the windows, looking for visitors, lively and animated discussions going on late into the evening, lights on in every room as the activity of the house continued, singing in joy in this household. The door of the house would have been continually opening and closing as people come and went into the street, back into the house, conducting the commerce of the day. There was a lot of activity in this house. This was the vitality of youth. But it wasn't always going to be this way. Eventually, the children would grow up. The children would move out of the house. The man of the house grew old, and the activity of the house diminished. The young men of the house who used to be strong, who used to carry the strong sacks of corn, would now become old and feeble, weak and unable to do this. The grinding in the kitchen would stop because there were no more mouths to feed. The children had moved on. No more expectant faces in the windows. No more activity late into the evening. The windows that were once filled with light are now darkened. The door would be shut. No more coming and going from the street. No more commerce with the outside world. The activity had stopped, and instead it was replaced with those in the street, the undertaker and the professional mourners, who were looming like vultures, waiting for the old man himself to pass. As the old man's health decays, and as his strength wanes, the house actually begins to fall in around him. The silver cord that held the golden chandelier, the golden bowl from which the light of the house would be derived, suddenly that silver cord snaps, and the golden bowl is sent crashing to the ground. The light source of the house extinguished, and the well, the wheel, and the cistern, the place where water was gathered for the house, collapses in on itself. Irreparable, useless. And finally, the old man himself dies in verse 7. All the activity of this house that was once full of life, once full of activity, once full of vitality, is now replaced with the silence of death. The warmth and vibrancy of youth had now dissolved into dust, and nothing remained. Life went on, and the old man was forgotten. Vanity of vanities, said the preacher, all is vanity. At the beginning of the book, Solomon started, didn't he, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, talking about the endless cycles of nature. We can see the poetic nature of this book, can't we? Of where in the beginning he talked about generation after generation coming and continuing on. And even though the generations of mankind are borne away, the earth abides forever. He talked about the cycles of the wind, the sun going up and coming down each day, the water running into the sea and not filling up, this water cycle that perpetuates, that everything in nature continues on in these cycles of going on and on and on. But Solomon said that's not true for you. Your cycle is coming to an end. You have a finite beginning and a finite ending. It's important that you think about that as we bring the conclusion forward, is what he's saying to each one of us. It's interesting because verses 3 through 5 also apply to the onset of old age, don't they? Not just a physical house, but our own house, our own physical house, as it were. You can see some of the similarities here, that the keepers of the house tremble, that the arms and the hands begin to shake, as even things that are done that require dexterity, like eating food or holding a fork or a spoon, the arms and the hands begin to shake. The strong men bow themselves, that the legs become weak and bowed. Those legs that were once strong become weak and bowed. It says that the grinders cease in verse 3, that the teeth begin to fall out, that those that look out the windows be darkened, that eyesight begins to deteriorate. This is something that happens to everybody, isn't it? The onset of old age and the body's decaying. Doors are shut in the street. No more communication with the daily affairs of life. The sound of grinding is low. Deafness begins to set in. They rise up at the voice of a bird. Nervousness or light sleepers. Music is brought low. There's no singing. There's no pleasure. They're afraid of heights. The fear of heights. Fears are in the way. Loud crowds are unnerving because going out in the street while being unstable on one's feet is a frightening prospect of being jostled around and being bumped and being knocked over and not being able to get up, not having the strength to take care of yourself. The almond tree flourishes. The white hair comes. The grasshopper drags itself. And if you've ever seen a grasshopper with one of its legs injured, dragging itself on the ground, it's a rather pitiful sight. He says that that's what happens, that we become stiff-legged and clumsy. Desires fail, that the body impulses grow inactive, and mourners go about the street, that the visible signs of death are setting in. This is something that Solomon's realizing faces each and every one of us. This is part of the design, of the way that this life works. And while it's uncomfortable to think about these things, Solomon's saying you have to think about them, because they're a reality. If our Lord Jesus Christ tarries, which I don't think he will, but if he does, he says this is a reality that each one of us have to face. It's much better to face that reality now than when it comes. Face it now, because then that will enable you to do what needs to be done now. And what he talks about here is the sunset. And I know a lot of us have seen the sunset, especially over water. It's very beautiful. But you can see the glowing orb descending over the horizon until there's just a very small sliver left. And then suddenly that sliver is gone, and life is over. That's where Solomon has brought us from chapter 11, verse 7, to chapter 12 and verse 7. A sunrise to a sunset, one cycle of life. So what's the conclusion of the book? Well, Solomon doesn't just give up on life, does he? Solomon continues pressing forward. Look at how he concludes the book. And moreover, in verse 9, because the preacher was wise, He still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. Solomon didn't give up. He realized this very late in life, I believe. But he said godly wisdom is the key. I'm going to continue to pursue godly wisdom, and not just for me, but for everyone who's going to come after. I'm going to set these things in order so that other people can read them and understand them and apply them before it's too late. He goes on to say that these words are acceptable words. Written was upright, even words of truth. These were words of the wise that were as goads, as nails fastened by the masters of assembly, which are given from one shepherd. He says that these are words that you can live by. It's like a nail fastened in a sure place that you can hang a great deal of weight on. He says you can put trust in the things that I'm telling you. I've explored this in my own life. I know these things to be true. Live by the words that I'm telling you. And look at the final appeal that he places before us in verses 13 and 14. He says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole man. The word duty is not there in the original text. This is the whole man. He says this is what your whole life is comprised of. How effectively you have revered God and how effectively you have done his commandments. Everything else will be purged. Everything else, when the Son of Man comes, will be consumed, won't it? And all that will be left, all that will be standing there, is how much we have revered God and kept his commandments. That's the whole man. That's the whole woman. That's all that we are at the end of the day, is what Solomon says. How much we've revered God and what we've done with the opportunities. Because God's going to bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. The ultimate achievement in this life is fearing God and keeping his commandments. And we say, well, is that it? Is that the conclusion? Seems rather simple, doesn't it? And it is simple, at least in concept, but it's profound in its application as we try to move forward and effectively apply these things. But I believe that Solomon is expecting us not just to stop at this last verse. That would be too simple. Solomon wants us now to reflect on the rest of the book and to see how the rest of the book has allowed us to arrive at this conclusion. There's been two things that have continued to come up throughout our studies together. One is the fear of God. He continues at numerous points in the book to bring up the fear of God and to try to show that there's a progression of development associated with that. The second thing is that he periodically steps back and says, this is what I want you to take away from this. Those are the two threads that continue out the whole book. They continue throughout the beginning to the end. These threads that are embedded, and I believe what Solomon wants us to do at this point is to take hold of both of those threads that are embedded in the book and pull them tight, to make them pop off the page, and to see what it is that he's telling us about the fear of God and about our development in relation to that. How are we supposed to apply that? Remember, this is the man that in Proverbs 25 said, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of kings to search out a matter. And I believe that Solomon has concealed those two aspects within the book that he wants us to understand. And Lord willing, tomorrow we'll take a look at those two aspects, godly fear and what it is that he wants us to take away in terms of our learnings from the book. And we'll consider those things in the context of Solomon's life, to see how he lived his life and where he ultimately came to at the end. But that, brothers and sisters, is for tomorrow. Time evades us for the moment. So let's consider the words of our Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 6, as he delivered the great policy speech of the king, the Sermon on the Mount, of where he told people, if you want to be a part of my kingdom, this is the way that you need to live your life. Just an excerpt from this section. I wonder how often Solomon must have been on our Lord's mind as he thought about his own kingdom and what it was that he wanted to establish. Can all of your worries add a single moment to your life? Is what that verse means in verse 27. No man knows the day of his death. Like being caught in a net at an evil time is what we read in the end of our previous class. Can all your worries add a single moment to your life? Consider the lilies. Even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Was Solomon on the mind of our Lord? I think so. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought of the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. And seeking God's righteousness means keeping his commandments, doesn't it? Fear God and keep his commandments are the words of the Lord Jesus Christ. Consider Solomon and consider what you should do in the context of his words.